This is Floss Weekly, episode 767, recorded Wednesday, January 24th. Owntracks. Are we there yet? Hey, this week we're talking with JP Menz about Owntracks, a modular set of applications that lets you track, view, and even share your own location data in whatever way you want to. But the most important thing is that you stay in control of it. You don't want to miss it on today's Floss Weekly, so stay tuned. Well, good morning. It is time for Floss Weekly. It's a show about free, Libre, and open source software. I'm your guest, Jonathan. I'm your guest. It's going to be one of those days, isn't it? I am your host, Jonathan Bennett. It's not just me. I have the wonderful Jeff Massie with me, which for some of you, this is a familiar face, but for others, this may be the first time that you get to see him. Jeff, welcome.
I am excited to be here. I'm normally seen on the Untitled Linux show with Jonathan, so this is my first Floss appearance, so very excited.
Yes, I am excited to have you here, and we're going to be talking today with JP Menz about Owntracks, and maybe not about Owntracks itself, but this idea you're a little familiar with, aren't you?
A little bit, yeah. I like riding motorcycles, and there's a lot of mapping software I've used in the past. I'm not an expert by any means, but, plotting routes and figuring out where you've been and where you want to go. And so I'm very excited to hear about this software.
Yeah, now I have used Owntracks in kind of a little different way. So one of the things that I do a lot with these days is the Meshtastic project, which that's LoRa radio and a mesh protocol for it. So you can have one radio here and one radio there and then one radio at your base station. And the far radio can send a message. It'll get repeated by the middle one and then picked up by your base station. And one of the things that we do with that is send GPS locations around. And I went to looking for some solution that would let you keep track of those GPS locations. I kind of wanted a replacement for Google Maps and the Google Timeline feature. And something that would work off-grid, even if you don't have internet access. And so I went looking around. I found one solution and went, oh, this looks cool, and saw that it was written in Java, and went, nope, look for something else. And eventually came across Owntracks, and I really like it. And so I've got a little Owntracks installation set up here at the house, and it'll when everything is working correctly, that's a whole different conversation, but it'll track me all the way across town. And then when we go to do bookkeeping at the end of the month or the end of the week, we can figure out where I've been and then, make notes about who we need to bill for it. So some fun stuff there. Let's go ahead. Let's not delay any longer. Let's bring JP on the show, and we'll get the word from the man himself. JP, welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes, it is great to have you. So let's talk Owntracks. Give us first that 30,000 foot view. Did we get it right? What is this project about?
Well, first of all, you owe me €78 because I read yesterday that you were playing around with Meshtastic and immediately had to purchase two devices to verify that what you were talking about actually works. But that aside, the 30,000 foot...
Sorry, not sorry.
The 30,000 foot view of Owntracks. Owntracks is a location tracking software. We have two apps, one on Android, one on iOS, written by two different people. There are basically four of us in the team. There's, on the one hand, Christoph Krei, who does the iOS software. Then originally it was Alexander Rust, but now it's Andrew Grouse, who's responsible for our Android app. Linus Groh, who's basically does our front end. And myself, I'm a bit of the janitor. I do a bit of documentation, and I still believe in Father Christmas, and I think I am the team lead, but I think I'm the only person who actually believes that. So Owntracks is an application which we originally created, which originally invented. And I was thinking actually yesterday, first of all, Owntracks is now, this year, we're going to be 10 years old. And Owntracks we originally created as a possibility, as a solution for a tracking app which does not deposit your data or my data, my tracks anywhere other than in a backend infrastructure that we control. So that was the original intention, and we are still today a little bit proud that we mostly manage that. I say mostly, of course, because there are things that we cannot forbid. For instance, if we use iOS, then obviously Apple and the Apple Map subsystem is going to know that we perform, for instance, a reverse geolookup. Yeah, but other than that, supposedly, if Apple is trustworthy, other than that, the data that is collected by these apps goes to an endpoint of our own choice. So that's the premise. That was the original premise.
And how does that data get sent around? What's the backend protocol?
The protocol that we chose originally, or that I originally selected, was MQTT. MQTT is a TCP-based protocol which was created for the Internet of Things. It's a publish-subscribe protocol which permits clients, in other words, programs, any application, any program, any scripting language, etc., to publish messages. Messages are published on a particular topic name. A topic is a hierarchical 64 kilobyte, if I remember correctly, 64 kilobyte UTF-8 string, which is slash separated. And a topic is created by publishing a message at that topic. On the other end, we have a broker. A broker is just a highfalutin name for a server, and the server knows about access control, for example, knows about security, knows about transport layer security, etc. And the server will also have, this broker will also have clients who are listening on particular or subscribing to particular topics. And if a client or if the broker gets a message for a particular topic and that broker sees there is a client interested in that particular topic, that message is immediately deposited at the client's doorstep. So the client need not poll. And all this happens with a binary payload of up to 256 megabytes and a very, very small protocol overhead. And that was one of the reasons why we chose MQTT versus, for instance, HTTP, which is a relatively verbose protocol. So MQTT was the method that we use for, or that we also still today use for communication. To be fair, meanwhile, it took a few years, but meanwhile we have also added the possibility that these apps at your choice speak either MQTT or HTTP, depending on the backend that you are able to provide. Right. But we have a preference for MQTT. It is faster, it is more lightweight. We have certainly done more testing in the MQTT area. So the whole application stack works better with MQTT.
Sure. Now, MQTT is unencrypted, right? And so I would imagine one of the big advantages you would get from supporting, I assume, HTTPS is that you can wrap it inside of a secure sockets layer.
Well, on the one hand, you are, of course, right. On the other hand, MQTT does provide TLS, transport layer security, what you just called, erroneously, I must say, called SSL, which doesn't exist anymore. It's called TLS, yes. But it doesn't matter. I know what you mean. And MQTT speaks TLS. On top of that, so we have end-to-end encryption between the client and the broker. On top of that, within Owntracks itself, we can, or well, not we, you can, at your choice, configure a secret key which is used by the apps to encrypt the payload. So irrespective of whether you use TLS or you don't use TLS, the payload can additionally be encrypted, and that is then decrypted on the receiving end.
So the way that I use it, I didn't know that, I had not looked deep enough to know that all of that encryption was set up. That's pretty impressive. The way that I use this is just with a WireGuard VPN, which on an Android phone is great. Although I think on iOS that might be a little bit harder to pull off. So what is kind of the project stance on that? Do you recommend that people use a VPN if they can, or do you feel like the Owntracks server is robust enough really to be able to expose it to the internet? Is the thing that makes me nervous the most about doing something like that.
Yeah, we don't have to expose the Owntracks server, the backend, what we call our recorder. We don't have to expose that to the internet. The only thing you expose to the internet would be your MQTT broker. Mm-hmm. And there you have a TLS connection between the client, between the app and the broker itself. So you have full encryption there. VPN, by the way, you just mentioned WireGuard, which might be a bit more, you said might be a bit more of a problem on iOS, is definitely not a problem. So it works perfectly well, okay. The same way that you would use it on Android. In my personal opinion, that would be overkill. It's just, it's just too much. You know? But if, or assuming a certain amount of paranoia, which is probably quite healthy, you could do, for instance, your WireGuard or any other VPN. On top of that, MQTT over TLS. And just to be really sure that you will never be able to see your messages, you could then encrypt the payload and forget the key.
So, I'll be honest, I'm not as network savvy as Jonathan, but I'd like to step back a little bit and just say, what made you wake up one day and say, you know what, I think we need Owntracks. I want to start this. I mean, was there an event or what sparked this whole thing?
There actually was an event. My child was growing up and wanted a smartphone, and we decided, yes, you can have a smartphone, but only if we can see where you are. So this was consensual. I think that's a term that was a politically correct term. And the original solution was to, of course, configure. It was a small Android phone, if I recall correctly. The original solution was to configure Google Latitude. This must have been in the year 2012, I think, roughly mid 2012. And once I saw what Google Latitude, or the data that Google Latitude was collecting, I thought, no, this is not a good idea. I really don't want to do this. And on top of that, that was the advent of Google Latitude sunsetting itself. I think roughly in the year 2012 or early 2013, they disintegrated themselves. Or turned into some other product.
As Google is what to do.
I can't keep up with the Google naming scheme.
Yes.
And that was roughly around that time where I was toying with MQTT for all sorts of other things. And I thought, surely it must be relatively easy to have a small app on a smartphone which collects a position and publishes that over MQTT. And that was all fine and dandy, but I have no clue on how to program these apps. So I asked around a bit, and Alexander at that time said, yeah, I'll do a prototype with Android. And my friend Christoph, whom I've known for very, very many years now, said, oh, I've been toying around with iOS. And we had the first version, which was sort of extremely minimal, but that was the beginning of what at the time, by the way, was called MQTT as a spoof on Latitude, and of course, due to the fact that we use MQTT as protocol.
That's great.
Now that name, I loved that name, but I think there were about 5 people in the world who could actually pronounce MQTT. There were about 17 T's in there. And then we decided at one stage, now if we want to become rich and famous, we have to change that name. And that's when we rebranded to Owntracks.
Very nice. Well, I mean, it sounds like, a great story there. And do you have any idea how large it's grown now? Where do people use this? Is this like global? Is this, adopted more in certain regions?
Well, you can ask me any amount of questions you want, and you can put thumb screws on me. But the good news is we don't have a single clue, because you see, it's not our data. We do not provide an endpoint. We do not provide a server. We do not provide any portion of the infrastructure. So Jonathan was mentioned earlier that he uses Owntracks. I didn't know that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't know. So to answer your question, Jeff, we really don't know. There are a few numbers that we have and a few bits and pieces of information. So I asked my colleagues, Christoph and Andrew, the day before yesterday, how many apps are currently installed. And the only thing we see is the installed, respectively, the updated user base. So we know that roughly 2 days ago on iOS, there were approximately 19,000, almost 20,000 active versions. So these are versions of Owntracks which were recently updated. But this, of course, could be, for instance, Jonathan with his iPhone 3 years ago, 5 years ago, he installed or he downloaded Owntracks. He forgot to remove it and it's been updated. Okay, that's all we know. On Android, we have roughly 13,500 devices, so we have a total of approximately, probably 35,000 devices out there which have Owntracks installed. Whether it's actually functioning, whether it's actually working, that we don't know.
Sure. Do you know, this is sort of an Android-specific question, but is Owntracks available like on the F-Droid store or any of the alternative app stores? And Owntracks has been available on the F-Droid store. Andrew pulled it down, if I remember correctly. We're still in a bit of a redesign phase. It's been a bit of a difficulty having that, but it is planned to be reintroduced, if it's gone at all, to be reintroduced in the F-Droid store. We know that there are people who have Android phones and who do not wish to use Google Play services. Right.
And for these, it is important to have a completely Google decoupled app. And yes, we have been there. I think it's disabled at the moment for a particular reason. I can't remember the reason. I'm sorry. But it is there. It is in planning.
Sure. I can only imagine that, the set of people that want a de-Googled phone and the set of people that don't want to share their information with Google has to have a lot of overlap.
Yes, definitely. And so it's important. And the request for an Android version on F-Droid is already many, many years old. I think something roughly in the order of 6 or 7 years maybe already. But at the time, or not only at the time, we just don't have the resources. We're a small team. We have one guy at the moment, one chap working on the Android version. And of course, I mean, this is open source. These are the things that we do in our free time, in our spare time. So it just takes a bit.
So a couple of different directions I want to go with that. And the first one is, so you mentioned this is a spare time project. It's a labor of love. Is there any plan? Have you thought about trying to make any, you kind of off the cuff earlier said something about becoming rich and famous from this. Is there any plan to make any money from it?
Yes. Well, there have been plans. At the moment, there are no plans. There have been plans. We actually must already be something like 6 years ago. We spent an immense amount of time and effort implementing something that we called Hosted. We wanted to offer the possibility that somebody could download the app, install it on their phone, and get going, and pay us a monthly subscription sum and then be done with it. So we have very many people who are very interested in Owntracks, in using the Owntracks apps and also getting the data, etc., but are just not either willing or just not tech savvy sufficient to get the whole infrastructure set up, because it is not easy. It's not simple. So we spent lots of months in testing and in-store or what are they called, in-app updates and in-app purchases and things like that to get this running. And it actually was then running. And suddenly we realized, what the hell are we doing here? We're intending to offer a product which goes 100% against our philosophy, and that is a tracking app which we do not control. So we actually tore out that software completely within a few hours, and completely abandoned that idea. So while we would probably want to become rich and famous, I mean, what did Facebook pay for Instagram? I think it was $5 billion or something like that. We'll take it $1 billion. It's okay. We don't have so many people, but I don't think that we'll actually get there.
Have you had anyone reach out and pay like bounties for particular features?
It's happened occasionally. We had one situation. There was a chap who was worked for the, I think, Australian Met Office, meteorological station, and they wanted to deploy a whole bunch of iOS devices, interestingly iOS devices, to obtain the barometric pressure. And so we thought about earning money doing that, but it took Christoph about 15 minutes to get the software done, and then it was just in there. Yeah. So Christoph is somebody who you give him an idea, and he just does it. Yeah, it doesn't talk about it, just does it. On the way to Mexico, Jonathan was mentioning earlier that I showed him the track of my route through Mexico. On the way at the airport in Frankfurt, I had the idea of being able to submit point of interest, which could then be visualized on the phone and also then later on our backends. And I boarded the plane, local time here, something like 13:30, and I deplaned in Mexico City at 2100 in the evening, and he had already done the software. Yeah, so so our software, our apps publish location information as blobs of JSON. So in this JSON, we have, for instance, latitude, longitude, obviously, velocity, altitude, battery level of the devices. So that can, for instance, be used for monitoring the battery level of your spouse's iPhone. We transmit, meanwhile, things like the SSID, the Wi-Fi SSID. There are people who have been requesting that in order to determine in which location are they? Are they in the office or in their home? We transfer a so-called tracker ID, which is a 2-letter indicator, which is used on the map, on the app, to indicate, it's Jonathan, or it's Jeff, or it's JP, who at that position. Then we have the possibility, for instance, of producing what we call transition events. So in the apps, you can define regions, geofences, we call them, or regions, which are circular regions. And when the app detects that it has exited that region, it transmits over MQTT or HTTP a transition event, which indicates I'm now leaving this location, or conversely, upon re-arriving, I'm now entering this location. And people use that, for instance, for home automation.
I was just going to ask about that, because you're both using MQTT. That seems like something you could tie into Home Assistant pretty easily.
Absolutely. I think the first integration into a home automation software was done by our friend Ben, who lives in New Zealand. And he created an integration for, OpenHab. Then somebody else, we don't know who it was, created integration for Home Assistant.
You could do some fun things with that, like automatically open your garage door when you get within a quarter mile of your house, or turn your lights on. All sorts of fun stuff.
Or it's evening, it's dark. We know it's dark. Please turn the lights on. Exactly, things like that. So that is used quite a bit, to our knowledge. When I say to our knowledge, is because somebody sends us an email, or because somebody raises an issue and says, I've been doing this and this and this, and maybe this and this doesn't work, etc. So yeah, as I say, to our knowledge, these are things that are done quite a lot in home automation.
Yeah, I imagine that the fact that it runs over, well, I mean, it's simple JSON over MQTT. That is a really accessible sort of data type. Imagine that makes it really easy to plug into all sorts of things. I mean, like what I did with Meshtastic, it's because Meshtastic supports MQTT. And so all you have to have is a little tiny translation layer right there in the middle. And it'll just say, okay, well, here's the Meshtastic stuff. I'm going to break this apart and then put it back together in the way that Owntracks wants it. You just sit there and take it off the server and feed it right back in, and everything's happy. I mean, it's basically trivial to work with. That must really empower a lot of things.
Yes, for people who are tech savvy and who like toying around or playing a bit, I think it is probably an excellent solution. We know for a fact that there are people who, for instance, do not use our official, if you can call it that, official backend or recorder, but instead have created their own backends because they pull out the JSON, parse out the elements that they want, and maybe store it in a SQL database or do whatever with it. Yeah? It's just really, really accessible, as you call it.
Awesome. So if I want to start this, I load the app on my phone. Now, is it at the most basic level? Am I ready to go? I mean, is it self-sufficient just in the app, or?
No, definitely not. If you wanted to start with Owntracks, the first thing that you would have to do, or that I would recommend you do, is set up some sort of backend. So you have two possibilities. Possibility number one is you have some HTTP server somewhere. It's maybe an Apache or an Nginx or whatever, or PHP. It doesn't really matter. Yeah, it could be Python, could be Java, whatever you want. Some HTTP endpoint which is able to get the data off the phone. Yeah, so the phone is going to via HTTP perform an HTTP post to your HTTP endpoint. And you can then get the data. You have the JSON blob. You can parse that JSON blob and do whatever you like with it. Alternatively, that would be my personal recommendation, is you would set up preferably, obviously, your own MQTT broker. There are a number of different platforms. One excellent piece of software is Mosquito with a double T, written by Roger Light. It's written in C, extremely performant, extremely capable, has access control lists and TLS and you name it. Really, it's very, very versatile. But there are others, if you prefer something in Java. There's HiveMQ, for instance. So you need an MQTT server, which you set up. And of course, you lock it down as strongly as you wish. And then, after you've done either the one or the other, then you download the app and configure the app to speak either MQTT or HTTP to the backend that you have set up. Now, this need not necessarily be yourself. So let us assume that Jonathan and yourself wished to do this together. You both could set up one MQTT broker, and via access control lists on that MQTT broker, you could, well, one of you, whoever's the manager of it, whoever is the system administrator of it, would define which of the two users can access my information. And from there, we get to the topic of what we call friends. So the Owntracks apps permit me to see on my phone, I think I have 10 people, permit me to see friends. So these are acquaintances, friends of mine who use Owntracks with the same MQTT broker. They permit me to see their location. I permit them to see my location. So on our devices, we see each other where we are on the map and the address and when the ping was last or when the post was last published, etc.
So I'm super curious. When you use the HTTP backend, does that completely replace MQTT, or do you still also have MQTT running between the two?
No, it can completely replace MQTT. However, certain things are more more complex to set up. So, for instance, this whole topic of friends is more difficult to set up. You need to do a lot more on the back end problem. Yeah, but no, it is a complete replacement.
Okay. Now, can you do it both ways? Can you have an HTTP endpoint that then just forwards off to your MQTT server?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Of course, that is certainly possible. So you would have an endpoint which you write in any programming language you want, and that would obtain, or that would get the HTTP post with the JSON blob in it, and then your software would publish that somewhere else. For instance, over MQTT or AMQP, or send it off by email, or transmit it to your Meshtastic thing to have it transmitted by radio to some other endpoint.
Attached to carrier pigeons.
Any number of crazy combinations are possible.
Sure.
Well, just to kind of continue on with that. So, okay, Jonathan and I are friends. We're set up so we can see each other's location. And I go on a motorcycle ride that I think Jonathan should see. Now, how would I share that specific trip with him?
That he should or should not see?
That he should. I'll say, Jonathan, this is a great trip. You ought to see the sights. Follow this route.
Yeah, if Jonathan and you are friends, then basically you do not need to do anything, because Jonathan at any moment will see where you are. So let us assume Jonathan kept his smartphone on, or his backend software on. He could follow you as you ride along. I think what you mean, or I'm going to interpret what you said slightly differently. Let us assume you both are friends on a single server, and you would like to show your family member, I don't know, I'm imagining a sister or a brother, anybody, aunt, uncle, doesn't matter. You would like to show your family member your trip. Now, you wish to have them see your trip. However, you do not wish to give them access, or unfettered access to wherever you are. So you can set up what we call a tour, and that is
Very cool.
You define that you're going on a trip, leaving Monday morning 8 a.m. and returning Friday at 1700. And you define that trip, you set it up. And that's, again, a little bit of a JSON. You could do that on the app itself. Currently only in iOS, but you do that on the app itself. And we store that on the back end, and that trip gets a UUID, or a GUUID. You can then share that GUUID to, for instance, your sister, and she can at any moment see the track that you have created from Monday morning 8 a.m. it was till Friday afternoon 17 p.m. And for instance, after your return, you go on another trip, but you don't want to see her. She will not be able to see that data. She only sees the trip within the time constraints that you have specified.
Okay. Yeah, that's what you interpreted that correctly, because if somebody's just watching me, there's going to be a heck of a lot of, going back and forth to work, and a lot of, kind of me to the grocery store kind of things, and not specifically being able to call that out. Here's the trip I want you to see. Now, would that person then, if they wanted to follow my footsteps, could they load that into like a Google Maps or a Basecamp or my own map?
In theory, yes. If they were knowledgeable enough to get the data, they would be able to access the data. We publish that as GeoJSON, and yes, you can load that into Google Maps or export it as KML, or as what is the other called, GPX, or as comma-separated values. So we have a whole or utility which is able to export this data in a number of different formats. But they would only see the data, and that's the important part, no? They would only see the data for that specific time frame.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
Yep.
Perfect.
We also have, this was I'm not sure how to politically correctly express this. So I'm going to be very, very careful, and I'm going to start off by using the German term. We also have somebody who many years ago said, well, supposing I have Owntracks and my wife has Owntracks, and supposing I go somewhere and I don't want my wife to see where I am. And then I said, okay, this is the beginning of what we will call the Puff-Schalter. Schalter means switch. And, well, can you imagine what the word puff means? Anyway, it doesn't matter what it means. The place that you don't want your spouse to know that you've been, okay? And so you can, and on the app, you can say, we want now in what we call quiet mode. We want, please, Jeff does not want his friends to see where he is at the moment because he's going to 7-Eleven or whatever, to a liquor store. It doesn't matter where he's going. Yeah? And upon leaving that location, Jeff could then switch off that quiet mode again, and then, for instance, his friend Jonathan would see where he is.
Yeah. So I'm curious if there is a way to do that kind of the other way around. So we'll just throw out a kind of a real life example. Jeff and I have talked about, because Jeff is way up in the north side of the country, and I'm down kind of south central. So we've got hundreds and hundreds of miles between us. We've talked about trying to get together, and Jeff maybe coming as a motorcycle ride. And it's like, well, it would be nice for me to be able to keep track of him on that ride. Let's say something happens and he needs pickup or help. So I can just imagine that for that particular trip, that would be great to be able to keep track of him on the way down. But I don't need to see anything else about where Jeff goes. I don't need to be able to watch him go to work or back. So how would you do that? Would you make someone a friend just for the trip and then revoke the friendship? Or does that give access to all of your points? How does that part work?
No. Technically, you could do that, but that's something that is something that you probably wouldn't want to do. Now, assuming Jeff has his own MQTT broker, and you have your own MQTT broker, then your Owntracks app is connected with your broker. Jeff's app is connected to his broker. You can, from our point of view, you can no longer become friends. Yeah, these two brokers would need to be bridged together in order to provide some sort of a friendship system.
Okay.
So friends only work. Friends today only work when we are connected to the same infrastructure. One of the disadvantages of not having a central system.
The Owntracks backend does not know about the Fediverse.
Yes, exactly.
Oh goodness, I don't know if that would even be possible to make work, but that would be pretty cool if you could make it sort of Fediverse enabled.
Sorry, somebody's drilling here somewhere. I'm holding my mouse on the mute button. Indeed, we can. Well, technically, we could actually somewhat federate MQTT servers, MQTT brokers, but that will be today beyond the scope of what Owntracks is.
Sure. That's the sort of thing where you would want some company that really, or some individual that really, really wants the feature to come and actually pay you money to develop it.
Yes, although what you just said is not uninteresting, thinking Fediverse and
Well, based on history, what you've been telling us, it sounds like that might be a couple-hour project.
I hope not, because it's very painful. That might be something. That might actually be something that we could think about. My imagination is a bit on the freeze now.
Yes, it's always fun doing one of these interviews when you ask a question or make a statement, and you see the wheels start turning in the guest's mind.
Exactly.
That always.
I've got a block here, and I'm making notes. So yeah, stay tuned.
So one of the other things I wanted to ask about is the GitHub repo, like the project as a whole. How much interaction do you get? Like, how many people have come and started it? How many people have come and forked it? And do you regularly get pull requests from kind of the greater community?
I do not keep track of the number of stars. We have a GitHub organization called Owntracks, so github.org/Owntracks, and then therein are the different repositories for the iOS app, for the Android app, for the backend, for the front end, and so on. And yes, there are occasionally pull requests. I noticed one recently for one of the Android components. There are, of course, people who submit issues. Today, I think we got 2 or 3 issues over the board. Sometimes for the iOS app, or for the Android app, or for the backend. Or we have a repository called Talk, where people can ask questions and sort of begin or initiate some sort of a discussion. Yes, there's a bit of interaction. Absolutely. I wouldn't say a lot, but certainly it's there.
So
I'm not quite sure whether I've actually answered your question.
No. I think that's a great answer. I will actually give a little bit more information because I'm sitting here looking at your GitHub repo. So the actual recorder bit, which is kind of the core of Owntracks, 731 stars, 111 forks, and you have 37 different contributors, which I've got to say that moves you out of the little tiny small time project demographic. It's actually pretty impressive, the amount of community interest and the community the community you've built around Owntracks. It's impressive.
Yes, to a certain extent it is impressive. I just see that Christoph is telling me 300 stars for iOS, for instance, 1,200 stars for Android. So yes, there are people who interact with us. I would like to slightly correct, only very slightly correct what you said. You said the recorder is like a central component, like a central sort of central instance for Owntracks. That is only partially true because the backend is eminently replaceable. So once again, if you, let us say you and Jeff set up Owntracks against your MQTT broker, and you look at the recorder and say, yeah, well, that's all very fine and so on, but we don't trust all the C code, we don't want this, we want to do our own stuff. Then you could, here again, write probably trivial amount of code, if you so desired. You subscribe to your own MQTT broker, you get the messages, extract your latitude, longitude, address, whatever you want to extract, and dump that into the database and visualize that somehow. So our recorder is a possible backend, but it's not necessarily the backend.
Okay, that's fair. So I misunderstood something when I first started using Owntracks. I think we ought to cover it here because it might help people out. You've got a web interface, if I remember correctly, that's part of the recorder to where you can go in and look at data. But that is not the preferred front end for Owntracks, is it? There's another component
you have managed to shame me. That web interface and the recorder is, or might I say is my best effort at trying to get data onto the screen. I love programming in C and in real languages. I detest anything that is web. Although there's one, I don't know if you saw, there's a table of live devices. Now that is really, really sexy, in my opinion, and particularly if you have a whole bunch of friends, because then you see them move and going from one country to another, and so on. That's really quite sexy. But indeed, the recorder is basically our data storage system. The recorder also records, if you so desire, reverse geo positions, which are stored locally and also cached locally. And the recorder provides an API, a REST API, with which a client can consume location data. And our preferred front end is the project that we call Owntracks/front end with a capital F. That was written by Linus Groh, and that is a really, really nice track visualization thing. You can select users, you can select devices per user. You can say, I'd like to see where did my friend Jeff travel from Monday at 8 a.m. till Friday at 1700 p.m. And then you get that track drawn at you. Yeah, so that is really, really sexy.
Yes, it is very nice. Now there are, as a user, there are some features that I would love to see in there, and in fact, there's an open request, and somebody already has a fork where they're working on it. And so, I guess let me ask this question to kind of hone in on this thought. Where does Owntracks need help? Like if somebody said, I love this project, I'd love to jump in and do some programming. Where would you point them at that the project could use, say, another programmer?
Where were you when I said $1 billion? Where do we need help? That's actually an interesting question. We probably need help all over the place. Or maybe we don't need help, but we could certainly use help. So for instance, there are a number of ideas in the front end that are awaiting implementation. There's work that could certainly be done on the Android app together with Andrew. There's maybe also work that could be done on the iOS app, although I can't think of any feature that's not yet been implemented there. So where we also need help, yes, we need help or time would be for me to rewrite the documentation, or something that I've been promising to do now for, 2 years or something. Our documentation used to be very good, but it's meanwhile, I think, just too complex. People are wanting a more point and click documentation, something simpler, something getting started quickly. Yeah, and I've been promising to do that for quite some time now. So those are basically the topics that we could certainly use help for.
Now, I kind of want to expand on that a little bit, but first step back just a moment and say, so you're talking about interfacing with your database, basically. Now, that's for the PC, or is this everything done on the phone for your, like your web and your preferred backend?
If I correctly understand your question, the phone, our smartphone apps today have a map which visualizes, which shows where the friends are and where you are. They are in charge of publishing location data every so and so often. They are in charge of publishing transition events when you leave or enter a geofence. But that is basically more or less it. Everything else occurs on the back end. So the data is stored somewhere. The data is then pulled out via for instance, the recorder API, and then visualized in the front end. That all happens, I think you said PC side. I would call it server side. So on the back end. Yep. But I'm not quite sure, Jeff, whether I've answered your question.
No, you did, because sometimes, at least personally, I find phone apps sometimes, if you have a large set of data, can be hard to navigate around versus working on a server or something like that where I have a bigger screen and a mouse to...
Definitely.
Okay.
Our apps have not been designed with that type of manipulation in mind. There is an idea for the Android app on maybe being able to display historic data on the device, so in the application itself. But I do not see that happening within a very short time frame.
Well, what features do you have on the roadmap for your Android and iOS?
There are a number of things that we have. First of all, for the iOS, we're working at the moment with so-called points of interest. So you can, when you're on the road, this is probably also going to happen on Android. We try, it's difficult, of course, but we try to keep feature parity if possible. So when you're on the road and you're sitting in a lovely cafe and you think, hey, I want to remember the name of this cafe and that I had, I don't know, a fantastic cup of chai here. You can add a so-called point of interest. This text is transmitted along with our JSON payload and stored, of course, in the backend database. And we will be visualizing this. We do that already on the iOS map, so in-app. I made a request yesterday that this feature is also added to the front end. And today, actually, I committed code which allows our recorder to automatically produce a GeoJSON dump of these points of interest. So that is something we're working on. We've been working with tours. We want to increase or enhance the possibility of doing remote configuration and also locked mode on both Android and iOS. So, for instance, Jonathan has set up an Android or an iPhone app with Owntracks for maybe a family member, and that family member has nothing better to do all day long than to muck about with some settings. And Jonathan doesn't want that. Yeah, first of all, it's a pain in the ass, beg your pardon, pain in the butt. Second of all, it causes extra support requests, so he wants to lock down that device. So this will be possible. We are adding logs at the moment, so better logging on the iOS end. This has already existed for a number of years on the Android end. On Android, we want to implement also tours that we have, like your motorbike tour, that we also have on iOS. Andrew wants to implement a so-called waypoint picker, which will allow to create waypoint, or what we call geofence, directly from a map, which today is not possible. You have to enter latitude and longitude. Android is tedious keeping up with the Google Play Store policies and all the work it generates. That's quite tedious. And what is also tedious and requires a lot of work is testing on real devices, because all these Android devices are just different. Mm-hmm. And so certain things work on the Samsung A, but they don't work on the whatever B version. Yeah. So this is a bit difficult. So these are things that are coming, to a store near you sometime.
Awesome. Now, so getting to the point you're at now, what are some of the harder pieces that you've had to work around, or what have been some challenges getting just to this point that you've had difficulty with?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We've had a number of challenges. It started off with battery churn. I remember quite fondly, well, maybe not so fondly, that roughly 9 years ago, I was several hours late to a client because the evening before I'd installed the newest iOS version and the battery was drained within an hour, so I didn't get my wake-up call. Yeah. So these are things that we've been working that have been tedious to test. Then what has been a lot of work in the past, now not so much anymore, of course, but is testing. So I drove thousands, and I'm not joking, thousands of kilometers or miles, if you prefer, it doesn't really matter, for testing these apps. And I know that Christoph, for instance, walked probably hundreds of kilometers in and out of regions testing transitioning events and things like that. So that has been quite challenging. But I think my favorite challenge, although it wasn't my challenge, but my favorite issue was a chap who created an iOS issue, number 388, if you want to look at it, which, if I recall correctly, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, the title is Significant Mode Not Happening at 800 kilometers per hour. Now that's 500 miles per hour.
It's a pilot.
This was a chap, I think he was called Neil. This was a chap, I think he's Australian or New Zealand, I can't remember, somewhere down under. And we were in contact with him anyway by mail because he had asked all sorts of questions. A really nice chap. Mm-hmm. And I wrote to him and I said, WTF? What the hell do you mean by 800 kilometers per hour? You crazy or something? He said, no, I'm a fighter pilot. And I take Owntracks on iOS along with me in the cockpit. And I noticed that at 800 kilometers per hour, this display is not updating correctly. And that's why I wanted to, that's why I submitted that bug report. So, that's really, to date, my absolute favorite ticket.
That's great. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
So before we let you go, I want to make sure and ask, how difficult is this to actually deploy? Is the the recorder in the front end, is all of that Dockerized? Is there an easy MQTT Docker? For someone that knows their way a little bit around a Unix command line, how challenging is this actually to get started?
I think for somebody who knows their way roughly through the Docker world, I think it is quite doable. To answer your question, yes, our stuff is Dockerized, so we have the recorder as a Docker container, we have front end as a Docker container. What we don't have today, and that's my fault, there's no question about it, is an easy setup guide to get somebody started sort of with, 27 commands to set up the backend infrastructure to get themselves going. That we don't have today. Mm-hmm. But if somebody is willing today to churn for an hour through documentation, they will, I think, relatively easily get themselves going. Yeah.
Honestly, I don't think it's even 27 commands. I've done the install a couple of times. I've written about it a little bit here on Hackaday. For someone that understands how Docker works and is not afraid of the command line, it's pretty easy to get set up. Don't let JP's modesty there scare you away. It's pretty trivial to get going if you're familiar with the Linux command line.
Yes, I do not disagree, Jonathan, of course, but let's also please not forget that there is quite a bit to know about Docker and how it works and how to set up variables and things like that. So it is a little bit daunting, and I do still want to, and it will happen. I just don't know in what century. Although, if you look at my hair, I have to hurry up because getting older. I do really want to create an easy setup guide, and yeah, it's in the works.
I would honestly, for getting people started very easily, I would honestly say just write a little Docker compose file, and boy, you could get that down to probably 2 or 3 commands and be able to have people up and running.
Yes, I think in our there's a repository called Owntracks/Docker-recorder, I think it's called. Mm-hmm. There is indeed a Docker compose file which does exactly that.
All right,
but even so, I have to say, just because I can launch a Docker container or a bunch of the Docker containers does not mean that the whole thing works. Let's please not forget that this app on the smartphone must be able to find that Docker container. So we're talking DNS, we're talking IP addresses, we're talking firewalls, we're talking TLS certificates, and it does all add up.
This is true. There are some of these things that I figured out so long ago and that I've set up on my own network so long ago, I kind of forget that they still exist. I suppose that is fair.
And I think that probably applies to most of us here, but for somebody who's really non-technical, I don't know if that's a word, but it can all be rather daunting.
Sure. Okay, so in light of that, let's say somebody needs a little bit of help, or on the other side of it, somebody knows what they're doing and wants to volunteer to help test the beta version of, let's say, the Android app. Where should people go to sort of get connected and learn more?
Oh, definitely to our respective repositories. So, for instance, when Christoph publishes a new version which fixes some bug that somebody has reported, he gives these people access to test flight, and they can then test a preliminary version. Likewise, Andrew does the same thing. It's not called test flight, but Andrew does the same thing for Android. So, when somebody reports an issue and when we request them to test, in I think most cases or all cases, they then actually go to the trouble to really then test the stuff for us and say, yeah, it's okay, and then we deploy it.
All right. Is there a Discord or a Slack server somewhere where people can come and chat live?
No. No, I don't. No, and it's not going to happen.
Okay.
That is not going to. That will happen. That will happen when Facebook buys us. No, it's really not going to happen because let's please not forget, some of us have real jobs,
Sure.
and or what at least pretend that we have real jobs, and no, we just can't offer that kind of interaction.
Sure.
That's why we have issue trackers for the individual components, and we try to answer very quickly. I think this morning I answered something in 5 minutes or 6 minutes. And that is excitement enough for us.
That is, that's understandable. That's very understandable. So, getting towards the end of the show, in just a second, I'm going to ask you if there's anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to, but I know that's some set math in your head, and that takes a minute to figure out. So I'll ask you a different question first, and that is, what's the weirdest thing that someone has done with Owntracks? What's the thing that most surprised you?
The weirdest, that's an interesting question. The weirdest thing. I don't think I can answer that question. And also, please, again, and as always, because we don't really know what people do, unless they tell us that
Right,
we've been trying to do this and this, and we can't. What's the weirdest thing? Well, maybe our friend Neil, or Nigel, I think, who took Owntracks up in his fighter plane. There are, Christoph is souffling to me. There have been, well, it's not really weird, but there have been people who were doing, I think, a marathon or something similar, who did 10 rounds around the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. And they were carrying, I think, Android or an iOS phone with them, and they wanted to record that. So that was, quite interesting. I wouldn't say weird, but it was quite interesting.
I like it.
I probably on the weird level, we would probably have to talk to the people who do home automation.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. So, and then I warned you this was coming. Was there anything that we didn't cover that you really wanted to let folks know about?
No, I don't think so. I think your questions were very good, and thank you for that. Maybe one thing, and that is, or a couple points. Interestingly, and you mentioned that earlier, you said that there's an integration with Home Assistant, for instance, or with Hubitat and so on. We find it, I would say, interesting, for lack of a better word, or a more politically correct word. We find it interesting that some of these people have done Owntracks integrations, but have never told us about it. So we know, and we get requests from people who say, it doesn't work with my Home Assistant, or it doesn't work with my this, or it doesn't work with my Life 360, or whatever it doesn't work with. And we can basically only answer, well, I'm sorry, you have to go somewhere else, because that's not us who do this in these integrations. So that is a bit sad. And what's also a bit sad is occasionally, it's happened 3-4 times in the past, that we've had issues raised on one of our trackers for a particular feature, which, and I quote, my customers want to have, end quote. Now, that's very interesting. And if you have customers who are using Owntracks, and by customer I associate payment, and we're not getting any of that payment, then I feel quite disappointed.
Yeah, that That's kind of the continual, the always ever present challenge of open source, right?
Exactly.
Is how you actually get some of the payment to the developers doing the work.
Yeah. And it's not. I mean, I don't think we are greedy. I think we've demonstrated over almost 10 years now. I think June is 10 years. We've demonstrated over 10 years that we have done all this free of charge, and you're welcome to use it. And we're glad that you use it. And if you pat us on the back once in a while, then we think, hey, that's cool. And so we don't really want the money. But if you say my customers, then please at least spend 5 minutes telling us what that is, and what you're doing and why you're doing it, and how we could maybe even help, even if it's possibly free of charge.
Sure.
Well, is there a donate button or anything, or buy you a coffee kind of button that exists?
Yes, not coffee, because I already drink too much coffee. I've switched to a gin and tonic now this evening because no, it's actually just water. There's no. The proof is there's no lemon or lime in it, so it must be water. So yes, we have a donate button, and I think my cumulated income at the moment is €1.69 per month. So yes, thank you very much. And that buys us 1.5 coffees every 2 months.
Oh, come on, folks, jump on board.
I'm not. But please don't get me wrong. I'm certainly not complaining. Okay, and I'm far from begging. That's not the point of this whole thing.
Sure. I imagine what you would be more interested in is when someone comes along and says, "Hey, I'm using this. I've got paying customers. I would like this feature." I imagine it would be nice to say, "I will contract you to add this feature." Like that. That's always nice when that happens.
Yes, it has happened, I think, once or twice where people said, yeah, I would be willing to pay. But then it sort of more or less petered out.
Yep, understood. All right, I've got to ask you 2 final questions. I get emails about it if I forget to ask them. And that is, what's your favorite text editor and scripting language?
Well, my favorite text editor is unfortunately VI, because I'm an old fart and I can't do anything else. In my next life, I'll do Emacs, but other than that, it's VI. It's in my muscles. I know VI by heart. I set my command line to VI mode, of course, obviously. So that's what I use, and I'm horrendously unhappy if you give me anything else, even though there are many wonderful things, wonderful code editors in the world today, but I just can only do VI. And scripting language, you said, programming language, I would have to say C. Scripting language, today I would probably say Python.
Okay. That is fair enough. All right, sir. Hey, it is past the bottom of the hour now, and we started a little bit early, so we definitely got a full interview in. I want to say thank you so much, JP, for being here. It has been a pleasure and a delight to talk to you and to learn more about Owntracks. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your very good questions, and it was a pleasure being with you today.
All right. Hopefully, we will bring you back again at some point in the future. We can talk about what has changed. All right, Jeff, what do you think?
I think this is pretty awesome software. I like the ability to, record and stuff and keep it out of, I guess, big corporate hands, at least somewhat. They're going to have to work a little harder for it to figure it all out. And, being able to send, it's a good way too to just send trips or something, or, because like I said, where I ride motorcycles, there's a lot of times where, we took this trip to wherever, and you can see this waterfall or monument or whatever, and okay, here's the route to take, and then you can share it with people and let them see what you've been doing. And I like that it's not, it's open source is always good, right? It's more control, less, Google killed it.
Well, that's one of the things that I like about this one in particular. So I think of kind of the location tracking for one thing, I use it for business to be able to keep track of where we've done work throughout the month. But one of the other things where it makes sense for me is kind of a safety. Being able to track someone where they're at, whether it's on a hike or on a long drive, and being able to have, okay, this is the last point they were at. I know they were traveling at this speed, and suddenly they fell off the map, and I haven't heard from them in a few hours. Well, if I need to go check on somebody, I've got that data. And so that kind of makes sense to me from even like a safety standpoint. And the fact that it works without having to rely on Google systems being up, or it's not sending things to Amazon AWS. You can host it yourself. That's kind of a big win for me. And then you can, if you really want to do the work, you can do this totally off grid. It generally works over internet, but you can make it work over Wi-Fi. You can make it work over other radio systems if you put the work in to do it. So I love the fact that it's so it's modularized the way that they've built it. You can build out your own system just using some of the pieces that they have if you want. And so I enjoy that a lot. I think it's really neat.
Well, and I use right now Life 360 for my kids just to keep track of them. And they're selling that data.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
sure they are. And this would be a totally good replacement for that, to where, okay, and I don't get all the spam built into that app. It does what I want, and it's, there's a little bit of work, set it up, but after that, then it's nice and clean, and no advertisements.
I think we may have talked Jeff into setting up his own little Owntracks server, so that makes me happy.
I'm going to actually look and see if I can get this done and see what it takes. And I don't know Docker. For those that don't know me, I'm much more proficient on the hardware side. I work in the semiconductor industry, so and I've been a Linux user for many years, so I know the command line, but I'm not a networking administrator expert by any means.
Well, you know some people you can come to and ask questions if you run into any problems.
and that I do.
Yes.
I've got Jonathan on speed dial.
There you go. All right. So next week, we're going to have Tony Zioli, and he's going to talk about WordPress plugins, open source plugins, and then free and open broadcasting. That's going to be really fascinating to talk with him. And our co-host next week, the plan is for Doc Searles to be back as a co-host. I'm pretty excited to have him back on the show, and he's gonna slot in where it makes sense. Still definitely a friend of the show. So looking forward to that. Jeff, do you have anything you want to plug before we close?
Just catch me and Jonathan over on the Untitled Linux Show on the Twit Network, and always happy to have you over there as well.
Yep.
And I really appreciate the being able to step into Floss Weekly. Been a long time listener, first time co-host, and I really enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun and really appreciate it.
Oh yeah, no, it was great to have you here. I appreciate it as well. All right, you can follow my work on Twit at the Untitled Linux Show. That's part of Club Twit, but also at Hackaday. Do the security column, goes live every Friday, as well as Floss Weekly, of course. And then one more thing that I'll plug. Hopefully, I don't have to plug this for very long. I've got a buddy that is a programmer, C++. Pretty much anything you want to throw at him, he can manage. And one of his specialties is Android systems bring up, and he is between jobs right now, and he's starting to have to think real hard about what he's going to do to be able to keep the house. So he is looking for something. If that is a piece of your organization that you need, get a hold of me and I can put you in contact with him. Great guy. That is the main thing that I want to plug this week, and we will see you next week on Floss Weekly.